In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a 68-year-old woman returning from surgery recovery was about to discover her daughter's desperate act of protection. What started as a simple taxi ride home took a shocking turn when she came face to face with locks that no longer recognized her keys. Margaret Chen wasn't your typical retiree. For 35 years, she had spent her life shaping young minds as an elementary school teacher, known for her fierce independence and unwavering determination to handle any crisis. When she encountered changed locks and her daughter's refusal to open the door, she had no idea she was walking into a web of financial devastation she couldn't remember creating. Margaret's fight for answers would lead to the heartbreaking discovery that her own mind had become her enemy. What began as outrage over a locked door would become a journey of acceptance and rebuilding. The house that love had built would crumble, but the family within would emerge stronger after confronting the devastating truth about gambling addiction, cognitive decline, and the sacrifices love demands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The taxi's engine idled as Margaret Chen fumbled with her wallet, her fingers still stiff from 3 months of careful recovery. The driver waited patiently while she counted out bills, his eyes checking the rearview mirror as she gathered her things from the back seat. Her hip protested as she maneuvered out of the car, the new joint still foreign in her body despite weeks of physical therapy. "You sure you got everything, ma'am?" The driver's voice carried genuine concern as he watched her struggle with her recovery bag and purse. "I'm fine," Margaret replied, her tone sharper than intended. The words came automatically, the same phrase she'd used countless times over the past months when well-meaning people questioned her capabilities. She straightened her shoulders, drawing on the dignity that had carried her through 35 years of teaching rowdy third graders and 23 years of single motherhood. The familiar sight of her house should have brought relief. The blue-gray siding, the porch she and James had rebuilt together 20 years ago, the Japanese maple they'd planted when Lisa started high school. Everything looked exactly as she'd left it, yet something felt wrong. The flower beds were too neat, the lawn edges too precise. Lisa had always been particular about appearances, but this felt different. Margaret approached her front door, keys already in hand. The brass key slid into the lock, but when she turned it, nothing happened. She tried again, applying more pressure, but the key wouldn't budge. "What in the world?" she muttered, examining the lock more closely. It looked different, newer, sheenier than she remembered. The realization hit her like cold water. The locks had been changed. Her hand formed a fist before conscious thought took over. The sound of her knocking echoed through the quiet afternoon, sharp and demanding. Lisa, open this door right now." Margaret's voice carried the authority she'd once used to quiet an entire classroom, but it cracked slightly at the edges. From inside, she heard footsteps, hurried, uncertain. Then Lisa's voice, muffled by the door but unmistakably tense. "Mom? You're back early. I wasn't expecting you until—" "Early?" Margaret's confusion shifted toward anger. "It's Thursday. I told you I'd be home Thursday. Now open this door." A long pause. Margaret could hear movement inside, but the door remained closed. "Mom, I need you to listen to me. There have been some complications. I can't let you in right now." The words made no sense. Margaret stared at the door, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. "Complications? This is my house, Lisa Chen Morrison. My name is on the deed. You have no right to—" "I know, Mom. I know it's your house. But there are safety concerns. I'm protecting you." "Protecting me from what?" Margaret's voice rose, and she was dimly aware of movement in neighboring windows. Mrs. Kowalski from next door had appeared on her front porch, her white hair visible even from this distance. From making decisions that that you might not be ready to make right now. The careful phrasing sent a chill through Margaret's chest. Something in Lisa's tone suggested this wasn't a spontaneous decision. This felt planned, calculated. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "But I've been making my own decisions for 68 years. Open this door." "I can't, Mom. Not yet. I need to know you're safe first." Margaret's hand pressed against the door, cool wood against her palm. Inside this house were 30 years of memories, photo albums, her husband's tools still hanging in the garage, the coffee mug she used every morning. Everything that made her life real was locked away from her. "Margaret, dear?" Mrs. Kowalski's voice came from the property line. The older woman approached slowly, her expression carefully neutral. "Is everything all right?" Margaret turned, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. The question was so simple, yet the answer was impossibly complex. Was everything all right? Her daughter had changed the locks on her own home. She couldn't remember why Lisa might think this was necessary. The keys in her hand, which had opened this door for decades, were now useless pieces of metal. "No," Margaret said finally. "Everything is not all right." Mrs. Kowalski nodded, as if she'd expected this answer. "Would you like to come sit on my porch for a moment? Sort things out?" Margaret glanced back at her door. She could hear Lisa moving around inside, but no more words came through the wood. The afternoon sun slanted across the porch where she'd sat with James on summer evenings, where they'd watched Lisa take her first steps, where they'd planned their future together. "This is temporary," Margaret called through the door, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Whatever you think you're doing, Lisa, this is temporary. This is my home." No response came from inside. Mrs. Kowalski's gentle hand touched Margaret's elbow. "Come on, dear. We'll figure this out." As Margaret followed her neighbor across the small patch of lawn that separated their properties, she tried to remember the last conversation she'd had with Lisa. Something about coming. Home about what? The details felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Mrs. Kowalski's porch was smaller than her own, but the chairs were comfortable, and the view gave her a clear sight line to her house. Margaret settled into the offered seat, her hip aching from the stress and exertion. "How long has this been going on?" Mrs. Kowalski asked, her tone carefully neutral. "I don't know what you mean." Margaret kept her eyes on her house, watching for any sign of movement in the windows. The tension, the difficulties. Margaret wanted to deny there had been any difficulties, but the words wouldn't come. Something had been wrong before. She left for recovery at her sister's house. Conversations that felt half-finished, Lisa's worried glances, questions about bills and paperwork that Margaret couldn't quite follow. "I've been away for 3 months," Margaret said instead. "Recovering from hip replacement surgery. My sister took care of me." Mrs. Kowalski nodded. "I remember. Lisa mentioned you were doing well. She talked to you about me?" "Neighbors talk, dear, especially when we're worried." The word worried sat heavy in the air between them. Margaret studied her neighbor's face, searching for clues about what she'd missed, what she'd forgotten, what had happened in her own life that everyone else seemed to understand except her. Inside her house, a light came on in the living room. Lisa's silhouette moved past the window, and Margaret felt the sharp pain of exclusion. After everything she'd sacrificed for that house, for Lisa, for their family, to be locked out like a stranger felt like a betrayal so deep she couldn't find words for it. But underneath the anger, something else stirred. A whisper of uncertainty, a question she didn't want to ask. What if Lisa was right to be worried? What if there were things Margaret couldn't remember, decisions she shouldn't be making? She pushed the thought away. Whatever was happening, whatever Lisa thought she was protecting her from, it would wait until tomorrow. Tonight, she would sleep in a stranger's guest room, locked out of her own life. But tomorrow, she would find answers. The Japanese maple rustled in the evening breeze, its leaves catching the last light of the day. Margaret had planted that tree with such hope, believing it would outlive her, that it would shade her grandchildren someday. Now she wondered if she would ever sit beneath it again. The unfamiliar bedroom felt smaller in the pre-dawn darkness. Margaret had been staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours, her internal clock completely disrupted. Mrs. Kowalski's guest room was comfortable enough: floral wallpaper, a hand-stitched quilt, the faint scent of lavender sachets. But it wasn't home. Every sound was wrong. The house's settling creaks, the different pitch of the heating system, even the way the morning light would eventually filter through curtains that weren't hers. She'd slept poorly, her dreams filled with fragments she couldn't quite piece together. Lisa as a child, crying about something Margaret couldn't remember. James working late into the night at the kitchen table, papers spread everywhere. A phone, ringing and ringing while she searched for it in rooms that kept changing shape. Margaret reached for her phone on the nightstand, squinting at the bright screen. 5:47 a.m. Too early to call anyone, but not too early to start making sense of what had happened yesterday. She scrolled through her recent messages, looking for clues about why Lisa might have thought locking her out was necessary. The text history. With Lisa was shorter than she'd expected. Margaret frowned, scrolling back through weeks of conversations that felt incomplete. Had they really only exchanged a dozen messages during her entire recovery? She remembered calling Lisa regularly, but the phone log showed only a handful of brief calls. One message from Lisa, sent 2 weeks ago, made her stomach tighten. "Mom, we need to talk about the finances when you get back. Some things have come up." Margaret stared at the words. She had no memory of receiving this text, no memory of responding to it. Yet there it was, marked as read. She scrolled further back, finding scattered messages that felt like half of conversations. Lisa asking about paperwork locations, questions about bank statements and insurance policies, references to the situation that Margaret couldn't recall discussing. Her hands trembled slightly as she composed a new message. "Lisa, I'm staying. Next door tonight. We need to talk. Call me." She hit send and waited. No immediate response. Margaret tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. Lisa's voice, carefully professional. "You've reached Lisa Chen Morrison. Please leave a detailed message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Lisa, it's your mother. I don't understand what's happening here, but this has gone far. Enough. Call me back immediately." She hung up and tried again. Voicemail again. On her third attempt, the phone rang twice before Lisa answered. "Mom." Lisa's voice sounded exhausted, as if she'd been awake all night, too. "Don't mom me. Explain to me right now why I can't get into my own house." A long pause. "Are you alone? Can Mrs. Kowalski hear you?" "What does that matter?" "It matters because this is complicated, and I need to know you understand what I'm about to tell you." Margaret sat up straighter, despite being alone in the dark room. "I understand perfectly well. You changed my locks without permission. You're treating me like I'm incompetent." "Mom, please, just listen. There are financial issues, serious ones. I've been trying to protect the house, but I needed to make sure you couldn't. That certain decisions couldn't be made until we figure this out." "What financial issues? What decisions?" Another pause, longer this time. "We'll talk about it later, when you've had time to adjust." "Adjust to what?" "Lisa, you're scaring me. I'm trying to protect you. That's all I've ever tried to do." The line went dead. Margaret immediately called back, but now it went straight to voicemail without ringing. Lisa had turned off her phone. The room felt even smaller now. Margaret got up, her hip protesting, and moved to the window. She could see her house clearly. From here, the upstairs windows dark, the porch light still glowing. Lisa's car was in the driveway. She was there, just 50 feet away, but might as well have been on another continent. Financial issues. The words echoed in her mind as she tried to remember recent conversations about money. She'd always been careful with finances, had to be, raising Lisa alone on a teacher's salary. But the details felt foggy. When had she last looked at her bank statements? When had she last paid bills? Margaret found her purse and pulled out. Her wallet, her bank cards were there. Checking, savings, credit card. She'd used the credit card to pay for her taxi yesterday. Everything seemed normal. Or did it? She called the bank's customer service line, navigating through automated menus until she reached a human voice. "I'd like to check my account balance. Please." After providing her information, she waited while the representative pulled up her account. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen, but I'm showing that your accounts were flagged for security review. You'll need to visit a branch in person with identification to access account information." Security review? What does that mean? "I'm not able to provide details over the phone. When you visit the branch, they'll be able to explain the situation and help you resolve any issues." Margaret hung up, her confusion deepening. Security review sounded serious. Had someone tried to access her accounts? Had there been fraudulent activity? She tried to remember the last time she'd been to the bank, but the memory felt slippery. She remembered going to the grocery store before her surgery, remembered packing for her stay at her sister's house, but the weeks before her surgery were increasingly hazy. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "I'm doing what's necessary. Please trust me." Margaret stared at the message, frustration boiling over. She typed back, "Trust goes both ways. You've locked me out of my own home without explanation. How am I supposed to trust that?" No response. By 7 a.m., Margaret couldn't stand lying in the unfamiliar bed any longer. She dressed carefully. Her teacher instincts kicking in. Appearance mattered when you needed to be taken seriously. She made her way downstairs, where Mrs. Kowalski was already in the kitchen, coffee brewing. "Couldn't sleep either?" the older woman asked kindly. "I need to make some phone calls. Legal advice, maybe." Mrs. Kowalski nodded as if she'd expected this. "There's a phone book in the kitchen drawer if you need it." Margaret paused. "Actually, I think I'll call David, Lisa's ex-husband. He's an attorney." "Good idea. He always seemed like a decent man, even after the divorce." Margaret found David's number in her contacts and called before she could second-guess herself. It rang several times before his familiar voice answered. "Margaret, is everything okay?" The concern in his voice was immediate and genuine. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. It was the first normal response she'd received since coming home. "David, I need your help. Lisa has. There's been a situation. Are you hurt? Are you safe?" "I'm safe. I'm staying with Mrs. Kowalski. But Lisa has changed the locks on my house and won't let me in. She's talking about financial issues and protection, but she won't explain what's going on." A long silence on the other end. When David spoke again, his voice was carefully measured. "Where are you now? Can we meet somewhere to talk?" "Yes, please. I don't understand what's happening." They arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, a place Margaret knew well from years of grading papers in quiet corners. David would drive over from his office. Mrs. Kowalski insisted on driving Margaret, claiming she needed to run errands anyway. During the short drive, she spoke carefully. "Margaret, dear, have you noticed any changes in yourself lately? Memory issues? Difficulty with decisions?" Margaret's defensive response was automatic. "My memory is fine." But even as she said it, she wondered if it was true. The gaps in her text history with Lisa, the haziness around recent weeks, the bank's security review, pieces of a puzzle. She couldn't see clearly. The coffee shop was familiar and comforting, filled with the rich scent of roasted beans and the gentle murmur of morning conversations. Margaret chose a corner table where she could see the entrance, arriving 10 minutes, early despite her anxiety. David appeared precisely on time, his tall frame filling the doorway as he scanned the room. When he spotted her, his expression shifted to something she couldn't quite read. Relief mixed with concern, and something else. Guilt, maybe? He approached the table, his usual confident stride slightly hesitant. "Margaret, thank you for coming." David sat across from her, studying her face. "You look good. Recovery went well?" "The hip is fine. Everything else seems to be falling apart." The waitress came over and they ordered coffee, the ritual giving them both time to settle. When they were alone again, David leaned forward. "Tell me exactly what happened." Margaret recounted the previous day's events, the taxi ride home, the changed locks, Lisa's refusal to open the door, the cryptic conversation about protection and financial issues. David listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled as she spoke. "She mentioned financial complications," Margaret finished. "Something about decisions I shouldn't be making." "David, what is she talking about?" David's hands wrapped around his coffee mug, and he was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret, how much do you remember about the months before your surgery?" The question felt like a trap. "What do you mean?" "I mean specifically. Day to day. Activities, conversations with Lisa, bills, appointments, that sort of thing." Margaret wanted to say she remembered everything perfectly, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was that the weeks before her surgery felt like looking through fog. She remembered the pain in her hip getting worse, remembered scheduling the surgery, but the details. "Some things are fuzzy," she admitted reluctantly. "That's normal after surgery, isn't it? Anesthesia can affect memory." David's expression softened. "Margaret, the memory issues started before the surgery. Lisa's been worried about you for months." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Worried about what?" "Decision-making. Confusion about finances. She said you seemed to forget conversations you'd had, appointments you'd made. There were some. Incidents with bills being paid twice, or not at all." Margaret's chest tightened. "I would remember that." "Would you?" The gentle question hung in the air between them. Margaret stared into her coffee, her mind racing. If what David was saying was true, if she really had been having memory problems before her surgery, then Lisa's actions might not be betrayal. They might be protection, she whispered. David nodded slowly. "She's been trying to handle things quietly, hoping your recovery time would help. But Margaret, there are legal complications now. Financial issues that can't wait." "What? Kind of financial issues?" David hesitated, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "That's something you need to discuss with Lisa. But I will say this, she's been trying to save the house. Whatever she's done, however it looks from the outside, she's been trying to protect what matters most to both of you." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about the past day, about Lisa's betrayal, was taking on a different shape. "David, is there something wrong with me?" His eyes were kind but honest. "I think you should talk to your doctor. Get a real evaluation, not just about your hip recovery. Lisa's been carrying this burden alone for months, and it's eating her alive." Margaret nodded slowly, pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a picture she didn't want to see. Her daughter wasn't trying to control her. She was trying to save her. And if that was true, then Margaret had been lost for longer than she wanted to admit. The coffee shop continued its gentle hum around them, but Margaret felt suspended in a moment of terrible clarity. The question wasn't why Lisa had locked her out. The question was, what had Margaret done that made it necessary? Margaret sat in Dr. Patricia Williams' waiting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The familiar medical office should have been comforting. She'd been coming here for 15 years. But today, everything felt different. The motivational posters on the walls seemed to mock her, and the other patients looked like they belonged in a way she suddenly didn't. She'd scheduled this appointment to prove a point. To David, to Lisa, to herself. A clean bill of health from her longtime physician would settle the question of her competency once and for all. Dr. Williams would confirm that her memory was fine, that the confusion was temporary, that Lisa's concerns were overblown. Margaret Chen? The nurse called her name with the same warm smile as always, but Margaret detected something different in her tone. Careful, gentle, the voice people used with fragile things. Dr. Williams's office hadn't changed. The same family, photos on her desk, the same diplomas on the wall, the same comfortable chairs that had witnessed 15 years of routine checkups, cold diagnoses, and recovery celebrations. But Dr. Williams herself looked older, more concerned than Margaret remembered. "It's good to see you, Margaret. How's the hip recovery going?" "Fine. Excellent, actually. I'm walking normally, no pain. The physical therapy worked exactly as predicted." Dr. Williams made notes in her chart, but her eyes stayed on Margaret's face. "And how are you feeling overall? Mentally? Emotionally?" "That's actually why I'm here." Margaret straightened her shoulders, drawing on her teacher voice. "There's been some confusion at home. My daughter seems to think I'm having memory problems, but I know I'm fine. I need you to document that so we can clear this up." Dr. Williams set down her pen. "Tell me about the confusion at home." Margaret explained about the changed locks, Lisa's concerns, David's suggestions about cognitive issues. As she spoke, Dr. Williams' expression grew more thoughtful. "Margaret, when was your last appointment with me?" "Before my surgery. March something." "Do you remember what we discussed during that visit?" Margaret frowned, searching her memory. She remembered being here, remembered the referral to the orthopedic surgeon, but the details felt slippery. Hip replacement options, recovery time. What else? We talked about the surgery, the risks." Dr. Williams pulled out a thick file and opened it slowly. "We also discussed your concerns about memory lapses. You mentioned forgetting conversations with Lisa, misplacing bills, difficulty following complex instructions. You were worried enough to ask about early signs of dementia." The words hit Margaret like ice water. "I would remember asking about that. You also mentioned having trouble with your finances. You said you'd written checks for bills you'd already paid and that Lisa had started helping you organize your paperwork." Margaret stared at the file in Dr. Williams's hands. "That's not... I don't remember saying those things. I recommended a cognitive assessment then, but you said you wanted to wait until after your hip surgery. You felt the pain medication might be affecting your thinking." The room felt smaller suddenly. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair. Show me what I said." Dr. Williams turned the file toward her. Margaret's own handwriting stared back at her, answers to a questionnaire she had no memory of completing. Her signature at the bottom, shaky but unmistakably hers. "I'm having trouble remembering recent conversations," read one line in her own hand. "Sometimes I start tasks and forget what I was doing." "I wrote this?" 3 weeks before your surgery. You were very concerned about maintaining your independence, but you wanted to understand what was happening to you." Margaret's mind reeled. She studied the handwriting, searching for signs of forgery, but it was definitely hers. The slight leftward slant, the way she crossed her T's, details too specific to fake. "Margaret, I'd like to do some simple assessments now. Nothing invasive, just some questions to see how you're doing." The simple questions felt like an ambush. What year was it? Who was the president? Count backward from 100 by sevens. Remember these 3 words: apple, penny, table. Margaret answered confidently at first, but as Dr. Williams progressed through the assessment, her certainty wavered. When asked to recall the 3 words, She could only remember two. When asked about recent current events, her answers felt vague and uncertain. Now I'd like you to draw a clock showing 10 minutes after 11. Margaret took the pencil, confident this would be easy. But as she began drawing, the numbers seemed to resist her efforts. She knew what a clock should look like, but translating that knowledge to paper felt impossibly complex. Her finished drawing looked wrong, numbers cramped together, hands pointing in directions that didn't quite make sense. Dr. Williams studied the drawing without comment, making notes. Margaret, I'm going to be direct with you. You're showing signs of mild cognitive impairment. This doesn't mean dementia, but it does mean your brain is processing some types of information differently than it used to. The words seemed to come from far away. That's not possible. It's very possible, and it explains why Lisa is concerned about complex financial decisions. It's not that you can't think or reason. You're clearly articulate and intelligent. But certain types of processing, particularly around new information and complex tasks, may be compromised. Margaret felt tears threatening. I taught school for 35 years. I raised a daughter on my own. I've been managing my own finances since I was 18. And you did all those things brilliantly. But brains change as we age, Margaret. Sometimes they change in ways that affect our judgment without affecting our sense of ourselves. Doctor. Williams leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. I need to ask you about something specific. Have you been gambling recently? The question came out of nowhere. Gambling? No, of course not. Online gambling, casinos, lottery tickets beyond your usual occasional purchase? I might buy a scratch-off ticket now and then, but I'm not a gambler. Dr. Williams opened another section of the file. During your last visit, you mentioned concerns about money you couldn't account for. You said you'd found receipts for activities you didn't remember. Margaret's purse sat in her lap. Almost without conscious thought, her hands moved to open it. Inside, tucked behind her wallet, she found a handful of papers she didn't remember putting there. Casino receipts. Online gambling confirmations. Withdrawal slips from ATMs she didn't remember visiting. Her hands shook as she examined the receipts. Amounts that made her stomach turn. $200 here, $500 there. Dates scattered across recent months she couldn't clearly recall. I don't. These aren't mine. Margaret, look at the signatures. The signatures were hers. The same shaky handwriting from the questionnaire, but repeated on receipt after receipt. Evidence of decisions she had no memory of making. Dr. Williams spoke carefully. Gambling can become compulsive when someone is dealing with cognitive changes. The excitement, the hope for a big win, it can feel like a solution to problems that seem overwhelming. Margaret stared at the receipts, her world tilting. How much? I don't know the total, but based on what you mentioned during our last visit, it was enough to affect your financial stability. Through the office window, Margaret could see the parking lot where her car waited. She'd driven here confidently, certain she was about to prove everyone wrong. Instead, she was discovering that the person she thought she was, careful, responsible, in control, might not exist anymore. What do I do? The question came out as a whisper. We get you help. We develop strategies for managing the cognitive changes. We work with Lisa to create safety nets that preserve your independence while protecting you from decisions that might be harmful. Dr. Williams pulled out a business card. I'm referring you to a neuropsychologist for a comprehensive evaluation. And Margaret? Lisa hasn't been trying to control you. She's been trying to save you. The drive home felt different. Margaret found herself hesitating at intersections, double-checking street signs she'd known for decades. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, and she caught herself slowing down for yellow lights she would have sailed through just months ago. When she pulled into Mrs. Kowalski's driveway, she could see movement in her own house's windows. Lisa was there, watching, Their eyes met across the small distance between properties, and Margaret saw something in her daughter's expression she hadn't noticed before. Not defiance or control, but exhaustion and desperate love. Margaret sat in the car for several minutes. The gambling receipts spread across her passenger seat like evidence of a crime she couldn't remember committing. Each one told a story of decisions made by someone who looked like her, sounded like her, but wasn't quite the person she believed herself to be. The hardest part wasn't the memory gaps or the failed cognitive tests. The hardest part was realizing that Lisa had been carrying this burden alone, watching her mother disappear piece by piece while trying to hold their world together. Margaret gathered the receipts with trembling hands. Tomorrow, she would have to face the full extent of what these pieces of paper represented. Tonight, she would have to accept that the woman she'd been was changing, whether she wanted to acknowledge it or not. From her house, Lisa's silhouette moved away from the window, but Margaret knew she was still watching, still waiting, still trying to protect the mother who was slowly becoming someone neither of them fully recognized. Margaret sat at Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen table, the gambling receipts spread before her like pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve. The morning light streaming through the lace curtains made the evidence look even more damning. Withdrawal slips, casino receipts, online gambling confirmations, all bearing her signature but feeling like artifacts from someone else's life. "How much do you think it adds up to?" Mrs. Kowalski asked gently, setting a cup of coffee beside Margaret's elbow. Margaret's hands shook as she tried to add the numbers. "I can't. The dates are all mixed up. Some of these go back months. Let me help." Mrs. Kowalski pulled reading glasses from her pocket and sat across from Margaret. Together, they began organizing the receipts by date, creating a timeline that grew more disturbing with each passing month. January, $150 in lottery tickets, $300 casino withdrawal. February, $500 online gambling deposit, $200 casino withdrawal. Another $400 the following week. March, multiple transactions totaling over $1,200. "Oh, Margaret," Mrs. Kowalski whispered as the pattern became clear. "This isn't occasional gambling. This is addiction." The word tasted bitter in Margaret's mouth. "I did this. I actually did this." The worst part wasn't the amounts, though they were staggering for someone on a teacher's pension. The worst part was that she remembered none of it. Not the drive to the casino, not the late nights on gambling websites, not the justifications she must have told herself as she withdrew money again and again. "We need to look at your bank statements," Mrs. Kowalski said. "The full picture." Margaret had avoided banking online for years, preferring paper statements that arrived in the mail. But now she realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd actually opened and reviewed one of those statements. Had Lisa been intercepting them, or had Margaret simply been ignoring them? "I need to call the bank," Margaret said. "Yesterday, they said I needed to come in person for a security review." Mrs. Kowalski nodded. "I'll drive you. But first, let's check your mail situation. You mentioned Lisa might have redirected it." They called the post office, and after navigating automated systems and providing identification, Margaret learned that her mail had indeed been forwarded to Lisa's work address. The forwarding had been initiated 3 months ago, just before Margaret's surgery. She's been handling everything, Margaret realized. Bills, statements, notices, everything. The drive to the bank felt like a march to execution. Margaret clutched her identification and the key to her safety deposit box, which she'd found in her purse and couldn't remember using recently. Mrs. Kowalski waited in the car while Margaret entered the familiar building that suddenly felt foreign and intimidating. The customer service representative, a young woman named Sarah, examined Margaret's identification carefully before accessing her account. "Mrs. Chen, your accounts were flagged because of unusual activity patterns and some concerns raised by your daughter. She has power of attorney for financial matters?" "She does?" Margaret's voice came out as a squeak. Sarah consulted her computer screen. Yes, it was activated 6 weeks ago when you were, let me see, recovering from surgery and unable to manage complex financial decisions. The document was notarized and appears to be in order. Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. Can you show me my account activity? What Sarah showed her made the gambling receipts look like pocket change. The checking account showed a pattern of increasingly large withdrawals, overdraft fees, and automatic transfers from savings that had depleted her nest egg from $47,000 to less than $3,000. Credit cards had been maxed out, minimum payments missed, late fees compounding. But the most devastating revelation came when Sarah pulled up recent correspondence. There's also this, Sarah said carefully, sliding a document across the desk. A reverse mortgage application. It was approved and processed 2 months ago. Margaret stared at the papers. Her signature was at the bottom, witnessed and notarized, but she had absolutely no memory of signing them. The documents showed that she had borrowed $85,000 against her home's value, money that, according to the bank records, had been systematically gambled away within weeks of the loan being processed. I need copies of everything, Margaret managed to say. When she returned to the car, Mrs. Kowalski took one look at her face and didn't ask questions. They drove home in silence, Margaret clutching a manila envelope full of financial devastation. Back at Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen table, they spread out the bank statements alongside the gambling receipts. The story they told was devastating in its clarity. Margaret had been gambling heavily for months, funding her addiction first with savings, then with credit cards, and finally with a reverse mortgage against her home. The total losses exceeded $130,000. The house, Margaret whispered. I've mortgaged the house. Mrs. Kowalski studied the reverse mortgage documents. These are dangerous, Margaret. If you can't make the payments, they can foreclose. And with a reverse mortgage, the debt grows over time. How could I sign something like this and not remember? Before Mrs. Kowalski could answer, the doorbell rang. Both women froze. Are you expecting anyone? Margaret asked. Mrs. Kowalski shook her head and moved to the window. A man in a business suit stood on the porch, holding a briefcase and looking official in a way that suggested trouble. Mrs. Chen? The man called through the door after Mrs. Kowalski answered. I'm looking. For Margaret Chen. I'm Tommy Vega with Pacific Debt Recovery Services. Margaret's heart sank. She'd heard Lisa mention debt collectors on the phone, but she'd assumed it was a mistake, a case of mistaken identity. Now she realized Lisa had been fielding these calls for months. Mrs. Kowalski looked at Margaret, who nodded reluctantly. She's here, Mrs. Kowalski called back. Tommy Vega was younger than Margaret had expected, maybe mid-40s, with kind eyes that seemed at odds with his official business. He introduced himself politely and asked if they could talk privately. Actually, Mrs. Kowalski interjected, I think Margaret could use some support right now. I'd like to stay, if that's all right. Tommy nodded and took out a folder thick with documents. Mrs. Chen, I've been trying to reach you for several weeks. Your daughter has been very helpful in explaining the situation, but we've reached a point where we need to speak with you directly. He laid out notices from multiple creditors, credit card companies, the reverse mortgage lender, even a casino that had extended her credit. The amounts were staggering, but what struck Margaret most was the dates. Tommy had been calling for months, and Lisa had been dealing with all of it. The total debt is approximately $180,000, Tommy said gently. The reverse mortgage payment is 3 months behind, which puts the property at risk for foreclosure proceedings. Your daughter has been making minimum payments where possible, but her resources are limited. Margaret stared at the papers, understanding finally dawning. Lisa's been using her own money. She's been trying to buy time, hoping to work out payment plans. But Mrs. Chen, I need to be direct with you. If we can't resolve this situation, within the next 30 days, the foreclosure process will begin. Mrs. Kowalski reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "Tell him," she said quietly. "Tell me what?" Margaret looked up at Tommy, seeing something in his expression that surprised her. Compassion rather than judgment. "I have mild cognitive impairment. I don't remember making most of these debts. I was gambling compulsively, and I don't remember any of it." Tommy's expression softened further. "Mrs. Chen, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen this pattern before, especially with seniors dealing with cognitive changes. The gambling industry knows how to target vulnerable people. What does that mean for my daughter? For the house? It means we have options. There are legal protections for people with cognitive impairment who've been taken advantage of. It doesn't erase the debts, but it gives us room to negotiate." Tommy pulled out his business card and wrote something on the back. "This is the number for a legal aid organization that specializes in elder financial abuse. I'm also going to talk to my supervisors about extending the foreclosure timeline." After Tommy left, Margaret and Mrs. Kowalski sat in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of Margaret's financial destruction. The afternoon light had faded, and Margaret could see lights coming on in her own house across the yard. "She's been protecting me," Margaret said finally. "All this time I thought she was trying to control me, but she's been trying to save me." Mrs. Kowalski squeezed her hand. "She loves you. But Margaret, she can't do this alone anymore." "How do you know so much about this?" Margaret asked, noticing how knowledgeable Mrs. Kowalski had been about reverse mortgages and debt collection. Mrs. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. "Because I lost my first house to medical debt. My husband's cancer treatment bankrupted us. I know what it's like to watch everything you've worked for slip away, and I know what it's like to rebuild afterward." "You rebuilt? This house?" "I bought it 10 years ago, after living with my daughter's family for 5 years. It's smaller than my old house, but it's mine. And Margaret, sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what really matters." Margaret looked across the yard at her house, where Lisa was probably sitting alone, surrounded by bills and legal notices, and the crushing weight of trying to save something that might not be savable. For the first time since being locked out, Margaret understood that the real crisis wasn't about the house or the money or even her memory problems. It was about a daughter who loved her mother so much that she'd been willing to sacrifice everything: her savings, her peace of mind, her relationship with Margaret, to protect her from the consequences of decisions she couldn't remember making. "I need to talk to her," Margaret said. "Not through a door this time, really talk to her." Mrs. Kowalski nodded. "Yes, you do. But first, you both need to accept that the house might not be savable, and that's not the end of the world. Sometimes, the things we think we can't live without turn out to be the things that were keeping us from really living." Margaret gathered the financial papers, her hands steadier now than they'd been all day. Tomorrow she would have to face Lisa with the full truth of what she'd discovered. Tonight, she would have to accept that the woman she'd been, independent, capable in control, was gone. But maybe, in acknowledging that loss, she could begin to figure out who she was becoming. The lights in her house glowed warmly across the yard, and for the first time since coming home, Margaret felt something other than anger or confusion when she looked at them. She felt gratitude for a daughter who had been strong enough to carry burdens that would have crushed most people, and shame that it had taken her this long to understand the depth of Lisa's sacrifice. Margaret watched from Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen window as a white pickup truck pulled into her driveway. 2 men in work clothes got out, followed by Lisa, who looked smaller and more fragile than Margaret remembered. Even from a distance, she could see the exhaustion in her daughter's posture. Shoulders hunched, movements careful, like someone carrying an invisible weight. "Contractors," Mrs. Kowalski observed, joining Margaret at the window. "Looks like maintenance work." Margaret's hands tightened on her coffee mug. "She's still taking care of the house." "Of course she is. It's what you taught her to do." The observation stung because it was true. Margaret had raised Lisa to be responsible, to handle problems head-on, to protect what mattered. She just hadn't expected her daughter to need protection from her own mother. Margaret watched Lisa point to something on the roof, her gestures animated as she explained whatever issue needed fixing. Even in crisis, even with the financial devastation Margaret now understood, Lisa was still trying to maintain their home. "I can't wait anymore," Margaret said suddenly. "She has to come outside eventually." Mrs. Kowalski nodded. "Want me to come with you?" "No, this needs to be between us." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Margaret made her way across the small patch of lawn that separated the properties, the manila envelope of financial documents clutched in her hand. The contractors were examining the gutters, and Lisa stood in the driveway with her back to Margaret, her phone pressed to her ear. "I understand the timeline," Lisa was saying, her voice strained. "But I need another week to finalize the loan paperwork. Yes, I know what happens if we miss the deadline." Margaret approached slowly, not wanting to startle her daughter. Lisa must have sensed her presence because she turned around, the phone still at her ear. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the driveway that had once been a shared space and now felt like a chasm. Lisa's face went through several expressions: surprise, fear, guilt, and something that might have been relief. "I have to call you back," she said into the phone and hung up. "Mom." "Lisa." They stood facing each other in the driveway like strangers meeting for the first time. Margaret noticed details she'd missed from a distance: the dark circles under Lisa's eyes, the way her clothes hung loose as if she'd lost weight, the tremor in her hands as she tucked her phone away. "How long were you planning to keep me locked out?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wasn't. No, it wasn't supposed to be permanent. I just needed time to figure things out." "Figure what out?" "Lisa, I know about the gambling. I know about the debts." Lisa's composure cracked slightly. "You remember?" "No, I don't remember any of it. But I went to the bank. I talked to Dr. Williams. I met with the debt collector. I know what I did, even if I can't remember doing." Arcee, one of the contractors, approached with a clipboard, but Lisa waved him away. "Give me a few minutes," she called to him. The men retreated to their truck, giving the two women space. Lisa looked around the driveway as if seeing it for the first time. Or the last time. "I found the first casino receipt in January," Lisa said quietly. "Just one, for $50. I thought maybe you'd gone with friends, a social thing. Then I found more. And then the credit card statement started showing withdrawals I knew you wouldn't normally make." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Why didn't you talk to me about it?" "I tried, but you didn't remember the receipts. You got angry when I asked about the withdrawals. You said I was treating you like a child, that you could spend your own money however you wanted." "I said that?" "Multiple times. And Mom, part of me wondered if you were right. Maybe it wasn't my business. Maybe you were just having fun, being social. But then the amounts got bigger, and you started forgetting other things. Appointments, conversations, bills." Margaret sank onto the front steps, her legs suddenly unsteady. "So you decided to take over." Lisa sat beside her, leaving space between them, but close enough that Margaret could smell her familiar perfume. "I decided to try to help. I started organizing your bills, setting up automatic payments, trying to create systems that would support you without taking away your independence. But I kept gambling. You took out the reverse mortgage without telling me. Mom, when I found out about that, I panicked. You'd borrowed against the house to fund gambling debts I didn't even know existed. The house Dad died working to pay off. The house you sacrificed everything to keep after he was gone." Tears started down Lisa's cheeks, and Margaret felt her own eyes burning. I would never intentionally risk this house. I know that. I know the person who raised me would never gamble away our family home. But Mom, that person, I don't think she was making those decisions anymore. The words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. Margaret opened the manila envelope and pulled out the bank statements, the gambling receipts, the reverse mortgage documents. $180,000, she said quietly. I destroyed everything. Lisa looked at the papers, her face crumpling. You didn't destroy anything. You got sick. Your brain got sick, and people took advantage of you. Don't make excuses for me. I'm not. I'm trying to explain why I did what I did. Why I changed the locks. Why I got power of attorney. Why I've been using my savings to make minimum payments on debts that aren't even mine. Margaret stared at her daughter. Your savings? My divorce settlement. My emergency fund. I've been negotiating with creditors, taking out personal loans, anything to buy time. I thought if I could just keep everything stable until you recovered from surgery, until your thinking cleared up, we could figure out a solution together. How much of your own money have you spent? Lisa was quiet for a long moment. Most of it. About $30,000. Margaret felt like she'd been punched. Lisa, no, you can't sacrifice your future for my mistakes. They're not mistakes if you weren't capable of understanding what you were doing. But you were capable, and you chose to enable my destruction instead of getting me help. Lisa's face flushed. I was trying to protect you. Do you know what happens to seniors who get declared incompetent? They lose everything, their homes, their autonomy, their dignity. I was trying to find a way to help you without destroying who you are. By lying to me? By controlling every aspect of my life? By loving you, Lisa shot back, by trying to save the only home either of us has ever really known. They sat in angry silence for a moment, both crying now. The contractors had finished their assessment and were loading equipment back into their truck, pretending not to notice the emotional crisis unfolding on the front steps. I can't remember signing that reverse mortgage, Margaret said finally. I can't remember most of the past 6 months. Do you understand what that's like? To discover you've been living a life you have no memory of? Do you understand what it's like to watch your mother disappear piece by piece? To field calls from debt collectors and casino hosts and mortgage companies, all asking about someone who looks like your mom but makes decisions your mom would never make? Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. We're both scared. Terrified, Lisa agreed. A car pulled into the driveway, David's silver sedan. He got out slowly, his expression wary as he approached the 2 women on the steps. Lisa called me, he explained to Margaret. She was worried about how you'd react when you found out about the financial situation. I already knew you'd been helping her, Margaret said. The power of attorney, the legal maneuvering. How long have you 2 been planning this intervention? David sat on the step below them, creating a triangle of conversation. There was no plan, Margaret. Lisa discovered the gambling debts and came to me for advice. I helped her understand her legal options for protecting you in the house. And you both decided I couldn't be trusted with the truth. We decided you needed protection, Lisa said. From creditors, from your own impulses, from decisions that were being influenced by cognitive changes you weren't acknowledging. Margaret looked between her daughter and ex-son-in-law. So what now? I stay locked out forever while you manage my life? Now we figure out how to move forward together, David said. The house might not be savable, Margaret. The debt is too large, and your monthly income can't support the reverse mortgage payments. So we lose everything. You lose the house, Lisa corrected. You don't lose everything. You don't lose me. Margaret studied her daughter's face, seeing for the first time the full extent of what Lisa had been carrying. The financial burden, yes, but also the emotional, weight of watching her mother's mind change, of making impossible decisions about autonomy and safety, of sacrificing her own security for someone who couldn't remember asking for help. "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "I'm sorry I put you in this position. I'm sorry I can't remember making these choices. I'm sorry you've been dealing with this alone." Lisa leaned against her mother's shoulder, the first physical contact they'd had since the lockout began. "I'm sorry I took your keys. I'm sorry I made decisions without including you. I was so scared of losing the house that I forgot the house was supposed to protect our family, not tear it apart." David cleared his throat gently. "If you're both ready to work together, there are still options. Not for saving the house. That ship has probably sailed. But for managing the debt, for finding new living arrangements that work for both of you, for rebuilding." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a release of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The house, her sanctuary, her symbol of everything she'd accomplished, the place where she'd built a life with James and raised Lisa, might be lost. But sitting here with her daughter, finally talking honestly about their shared crisis, she realized Mrs. Kowalski had been right. Sometimes the things we think we can't live without are the things that keep us from really living. "Okay," Margaret said. "Let's figure this out together. But Lisa, no more secrets. No more protecting me from information I need to know. If we're going to lose everything, we lose it together." Lisa nodded, tears still flowing. Together. David smiled for the first time since arriving. Together is a good place to start. The contractors finished loading their truck and approached with the clipboard again. This time, Lisa didn't wave them away. She looked at Margaret. "The roof needs work," Lisa explained. "About $3,000. Given our situation, I'm going to tell them we can't afford it right now." Margaret nodded. "Good choice. The house can leak for a while if it has to." It was a small moment, but it felt like the beginning of something new. A partnership based on honesty rather than protection. On shared reality rather than maintained illusions. The house that love had built might be crumbling, but maybe they could build something better from what remained. Margaret stood in her own kitchen for the first time in 3 days, running her fingers along the familiar granite countertop. Everything looked the same, the coffee maker in its usual spot, the fruit bowl James had given her for their 10th anniversary, the stack of mail Lisa had been intercepting, but the space felt different, changed, like a room she was visiting rather than inhabiting. "I put fresh sheets on your bed," Lisa said from the doorway, her voice carefully neutral. "And I moved some of the financial papers to the dining room table so we can go through them together." The word "together" still felt fragile between them, a promise they were both afraid to break. They'd negotiated Margaret's return carefully. She could live in her own house, but major financial decisions would be made jointly. Lisa would no longer intercept her mail, but Margaret would review all correspondence with her daughter present. It was an uneasy compromise between independence and protection. "Thank you," Margaret said, meaning more than just the sheets. They'd agreed to meet with Tommy Vega that afternoon, presenting a united front rather than the fractured family he'd encountered at Mrs. Kowalski's house. Margaret had spent the morning reviewing the debt consolidation materials he'd provided, trying to understand options that seemed both promising and overwhelming. When Tommy arrived, he spread documents across the dining room table that had once hosted family dinners and homework sessions. Now it served as a war room for financial triage. "The good news," Tommy began, "is that several creditors are willing to negotiate, especially given Mrs. Chen's medical situation. The gambling addiction combined with cognitive impairment creates legal grounds for reducing some of the debt." Lisa leaned forward. "How much reduction?" "Potentially 30 to 40% if we can document the medical timeline properly. Dr. Williams' assessment will be crucial." Margaret had returned to Dr. Williams that morning for a comprehensive cognitive evaluation. The formal assessment confirmed mild cognitive impairment, but also established that Margaret retained capacity for most decisions. She wasn't incompetent. She was impaired in specific areas, particularly around complex financial judgment and impulse control. "What about the reverse mortgage?" Margaret asked. Tommy's expression grew more serious. "That's the challenge. The reverse mortgage is secured by the house, and the lender has fewer incentives to negotiate. You're currently $8,400 behind on payments, and they can begin foreclosure proceedings next month." Lisa pulled out a folder. "I've been working on a plan. If we can reduce the other debts by 40%, and if I take a second mortgage on my condo, we might be able to catch up the reverse mortgage payments and create a sustainable budget going forward." Margaret stared at her daughter. "You want to mortgage your home to save mine?" "I want to keep our family together." "Lisa, no." Margaret's voice was firmer than it had been in days. "You've already spent your savings. You can't risk your condo, too. It's a calculated risk. If we can stabilize the situation. If we can't, you lose everything, too." Tommy cleared his throat diplomatically. "There is another option. We could explore selling the house voluntarily rather than facing foreclosure. Given the market, you might net enough to pay off the reverse mortgage and have something left over for a fresh start." The suggestion hung in the air between mother and daughter like a challenge. Lisa's face tightened. "This house is our family history," Lisa said. "Dad worked 2 jobs to make the mortgage payments. You spent 35 years building equity here. We can't just walk away." "Maybe we can't stay either," Margaret replied quietly. "Lisa, I love this house, but I love you more than any building. I won't let you sacrifice your security for my mistakes." "They weren't mistakes if you weren't capable of—" "Stop." Margaret held up her hand. "Please stop making excuses for me. I was sick, yes, but I was also stubborn. I was too proud to ask for help when I first noticed problems with my memory. I was too embarrassed to admit I was gambling. My pride contributed to this crisis as much as my illness did." Tommy watched the exchange with professional patience, but Margaret could see him taking notes, family dynamics that would affect whatever solution they ultimately chose. "Let me ask you both this," Tommy said. "If we could save the house, what would that look like day to day? Mrs. Chen, you'd need ongoing supervision for financial decisions. Ms. Morrison, you'd need to maintain dual households and continue supporting both. Is that sustainable long-term?" Lisa and Margaret looked at each other across the table. The honest answer was probably no. "What if we sold?" Margaret asked. "What would that look like?" Tommy consulted his calculator. "Conservatively, the house would sell for around $320,000. After paying off the reverse mortgage, remaining debts, and selling costs, you'd probably clear $80,000 to $100,000. That's enough for a substantial down payment on something smaller or a few years of rent while you rebuild." "We could find a duplex," Lisa said slowly, the idea clearly painful but not impossible. "Live near each other but separately." "Or we could find a place together," Margaret suggested. "Something smaller, more manageable. I'd have help when I need it, but you'd have your own life." Tommy gathered his papers, sensing they needed time to process. "Take a week to think about it. The foreclosure timeline gives us a little breathing room, but not much." After he left, Margaret and Lisa sat at the dining room table, surrounded by evidence of their financial devastation, but no longer drowning in it. They had options now, limited, painful options, but choices nonetheless. "I keep thinking about what Mrs. Kowalski said," Margaret admitted, "about losing everything being the only way to find out what really matters." Lisa traced patterns on the table with her finger. "What really matters to you, Mom?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "You, your happiness, your future, being useful rather than just being comfortable. The house represents security." "To me," Lisa said, Stability. Proof that we made it through Dad's death and came out okay. But did we? Come out okay, I mean. Lisa looked around the dining room, at the china cabinet filled with dishes they never used, the formal furniture that had impressed guests they rarely entertained, the photographs documenting a life that felt increasingly distant. Maybe we came out survivors, Lisa said finally, but I'm not sure we came out okay. Margaret nodded. Mrs. Kowalski rebuilt. She lost her house and rebuilt something better. Maybe we can too. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of decision still ahead of them, but no longer pressing down quite so heavily. Tomorrow they would call Dr. Williams for copies of the cognitive assessment. They would research housing options and calculate budgets for different scenarios. They would begin the practical work of rebuilding. But tonight, they were together in the house that love had built, acknowledging that love sometimes meant letting go. Margaret woke up on the kitchen floor, her cheek pressed against the cold linoleum, sunlight streaming through the window at an angle that told her she'd been unconscious for hours. Her left hip, the one that had been surgically repaired, throbbed, with a familiar pain that sent panic shooting through her chest. She tried to remember what had happened. She'd been making coffee, she thought. Or maybe lunch? The digital clock on the microwave read 2:47 p.m., but she couldn't remember what time she'd gotten up that morning. Lisa had left for work around 8, kissing Margaret's forehead and reminding her to call if she needed anything. Margaret attempted to sit up and immediately regretted it. The room spun sickeningly, and she had to close her eyes until the dizziness passed. When she opened them again, she noticed broken pieces of her favorite coffee mug scattered across the floor, the one Lisa had made for her in a high school ceramics class, glazed in uneven blues and greens. "Okay," she whispered to herself, using the voice she'd once used to calm frightened students. "Okay, Margaret. Think." But thinking felt like walking through fog. She remembered waking up in her own bed for the first time in days, remembered Lisa leaving for work, remembered feeling proud of being trusted alone in the house again. After that, everything became fragments, standing at the counter, reaching for something in the high cabinet, a sensation of falling. Her phone was on the kitchen table, just feet away but might as well have been miles. Margaret tried crawling toward it, but her left leg wouldn't cooperate properly. Not the hip. That was sore but functional. Something else. Some disconnect between her brain and her body that frightened her more than the fall itself. She was still struggling to reach the table when she heard Lisa's key in the front door. "Mom? I brought lunch from that sandwich place you like." Lisa's voice cut off abruptly as she rounded the corner into the kitchen. Oh, God, Mom. What happened?" Lisa dropped her purse and knelt beside Margaret, her hands fluttering over her mother's body, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did you hit your head? How long have you been down here?" Margaret wanted to answer, but the questions came too fast and her thoughts felt sluggish. "I'm okay," she managed. "Just fell." "Just fell?" Lisa's voice pitched higher. "You're on the floor surrounded by broken glass and you don't remember how you got here. This is not okay." Lisa pulled out her phone, already dialing 911, but Margaret grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "No ambulance, please, I'm not badly hurt." "Mom, you could have a concussion. You could have re-injured your hip." "You can't make medical decisions when you're confused." The words stung because they were probably true. Margaret felt confused, disoriented in a way that was different from her usual memory problems. But the thought of paramedics, emergency, rooms, more medical evaluations that would further document her decline, it felt like a step toward complete loss of independence. "Help me to the couch," Margaret said. "We'll call Dr. Williams if I don't feel better in an hour." Lisa's jaw tightened, but she helped Margaret up carefully, supporting most of her weight as they moved slowly to the living room. Once Margaret was settled with ice on her hip and water in her hand, Lisa began the interrogation Margaret had been dreading. "What's the last thing you remember clearly?" You leaving for work? That was 7 hours ago, Mom. 7 hours. What if you'd been seriously injured? What if you'd hit your head and been bleeding? I wouldn't have found you until evening. Margaret closed her eyes, fighting off another wave of dizziness. I wanted to prove I could manage alone. And you can't. Lisa's voice was flat, matter of fact in a way that was somehow worse than anger. You can't manage alone, and I can't keep pretending that you can. Dr. Williams arrived within an hour, making a house call that Margaret suspected Lisa had insisted on. The examination was thorough, but gentle, checking Margaret's pupils, testing her reflexes, asking questions about pain and confusion. No sign of serious head injury, Dr. Williams concluded. But Margaret, this type of fall, combined with the confusion and memory gaps, suggests your cognitive impairment may be progressing. Progressing how fast? Lisa asked. There's no way to predict. Some people stabilize at mild impairment for years, others decline more rapidly. But episodes like this, losing time, falling due to confusion, these are warning signs that living alone may no longer be safe. After Dr. Williams left, Margaret and Lisa sat in silence in the living room. The afternoon light was fading and neither of them had turned on lamps. The darkness felt appropriate for the conversation they needed to have. The debt consolidation plan is off the table anyway, Lisa said quietly. Tommy called this morning. 2 more creditors have filed claims against the house. Companies I'd never heard of. The total debt is closer to $220,000 now. Margaret felt the number like a physical weight. So we're definitely losing the house. The foreclosure notice came today, 30 days. They sat with that information, the reality of it settling, around them like dust. All their careful planning, all their negotiations and compromises had been rendered meaningless by mathematics they couldn't overcome. I can't take care of you if we're both homeless, Lisa said, her voice breaking. I can't protect you if I don't have any resources left. Margaret looked around the living room, at the piano she'd played for Lisa as a child, at the bookshelves, filled with novels she'd taught for decades, at the photographs documenting a life she was increasingly unable to remember clearly. What if we're asking the wrong question? Margaret said slowly. What if the question isn't how to save the house, but how to save each other? Lisa turned to her, tears reflecting the last light from the window. What do you mean? I mean, maybe the house is already gone. Maybe it's been gone since I signed that reverse mortgage I can't remember. Maybe we're fighting to preserve something that's already lost instead of building something new. I don't know how to let go of this place. Neither do I. But Lisa? Today showed us both something important. I'm not safe living alone, and you're not safe trying to manage my care while working full-time and maintaining your own life. Something has to change. Lisa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The counselor said that loving someone sometimes means accepting that you can't fix everything. Maybe it means accepting that some things are too broken to fix, but the people involved aren't. They called Tommy Vega that evening and told him they wanted to explore selling the house voluntarily. They called David and asked him to help them understand their legal options for protected housing arrangements. They called Mrs. Kowalski and asked if she knew anything about senior living communities that allowed family members to live nearby. None of the calls were easy. Each one felt like a small surrender, another piece of Margaret's independence dissolving. But by the time they'd finished making their inquiries, something had shifted between them. The crisis had forced them past their individual fears and into shared problem-solving. I'm scared, Lisa admitted as they prepared for bed. So am I, Margaret replied. But I'm more scared of losing you than I am of losing this house. It wasn't resolution. They still faced homelessness in 30 days, massive debt, and Margaret's progressive cognitive decline. But it was acceptance. And for the first time since Margaret had come home to find her locks changed, acceptance felt like the beginning of a solution rather than the end of hope. The house that love had built was crumbling around them, But maybe love itself was stronger than any foundation they'd ever laid. Margaret stood in the doorway of her bedroom, looking at the same wallpaper she'd put up 23 years ago when Lisa graduated high school. Tiny roses on a cream background, faded now but still delicate. She'd chosen it to celebrate a new phase of life, Lisa heading to college, Margaret facing an empty nest, both of them becoming the women they were meant to be. Now she was facing another transition, but this one felt less like celebration and more like surrender. "The realtor will be here in an hour," Lisa called from downstairs. "Do you want me to handle the initial consultation?" "No," Margaret replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I want to be part of it. It's still my house until it isn't." They'd spent the morning sorting through 30 years of accumulated life, deciding what was essential, what was sentimental, and what was simply taking up space. The process was more emotional than Margaret had expected. Every box revealed forgotten treasures, Lisa's elementary school artwork, letters from James during his brief deployment to Germany, Christmas ornaments that told the story of their family's evolution. Mrs. Kowalski had come over to help, bringing boxes and the kind of practical wisdom that only came from experience. "The hardest part isn't losing the things," she said, wrapping Margaret's wedding china in newspaper. "It's letting go of the person you were when you owned them." Margaret paused in folding James's old sweaters, too worn to donate but too precious to discard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the woman who bought this china was planning dinner parties and holiday gatherings. The woman who hung this wallpaper was creating a home for a family. When you lose the house, you have to grieve not just the building but the version of yourself that lived here." Lisa looked up from the photo albums she was organizing. "But you rebuilt, right? You found a new version of yourself?" Mrs. Kowalski smiled, her hands never stopping their careful wrapping. "I found a better version. Turns out I was more than the sum of my possessions. Took losing everything to figure that out." The realtor arrived precisely on time, a brisk woman named Janet who managed to be both professional and compassionate as she assessed their situation. She walked through the house with Margaret and Lisa, taking notes and photos while explaining the process of a short sale. "Given the market and the home's condition, I think we can reasonably expect $315,000, Janet said, settling at the kitchen table with her paperwork. "After the reverse mortgage payoff and selling costs, you'll clear about $85,000. That won't cover all your debts, but it's a significant start." Margaret nodded, the numbers feeling both devastating and liberating. "How quickly can we move?" "If we list tomorrow and price aggressively, we should have offers within 2 weeks. Closing could happen within 60 days. "That cuts it close with the foreclosure timeline," Lisa observed. "It does, but voluntary sale is better for everyone, better for your credit, better financially, and you have more control over the process." After Janet left, Margaret and Lisa sat in the kitchen, surrounded by boxes and the detritus of their sorting efforts. The house felt different already, less like a home and more like a collection of rooms waiting for new occupants. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Margaret said carefully. "For me, I mean. Where I'll live." Lisa's hands stilled on the photo album she'd been organizing. "We talked about finding a place together. We talked about it. But Lisa, yesterday showed us both that I need more support than either of us wants to admit. You can't be my full-time caregiver and still have your own life." "I don't mind." "I mind." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "I mind very much. You're 38 years old. You should be focused on your career, maybe dating, certainly not managing your mother's medication and monitoring her for Raj. Falls." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to let you go." "You're not letting me go. You're helping me find a way to live with dignity while I still can." They'd visited 3 assisted living communities over the past week. David's suggestion, implemented with careful research and multiple tours. The facilities ranged from depressing institutional warehouses to luxury communities that felt more like resort hotels. But one place, Sunrise Gardens, had felt different. "It's only 15 minutes from your condo," Margaret continued. "They have different levels of care, so if I need more support later, I won't have to move again. And Lisa, they have activities, classes, people my age dealing with similar issues. I might actually make friends." "You make it sound appealing." "Maybe it is. Maybe the thing I've been fighting, giving up this house, accepting help, being around other people. Maybe it's actually what I need." Lisa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "The memory care wing has a good reputation." Margaret felt a chill. "You researched that?" "I researched everything. Mom, your condition is going to progress. Probably not quickly, but eventually you'll need specialized care. Sunrise Gardens has a continuum of services. When the time comes, you won't have to leave a place you've gotten comfortable with." The practical conversation felt surreal, like discussing funeral arrangements for someone who was still very much alive. But Margaret appreciated Lisa's thoroughness, her willingness to look ahead to difficult realities. "The apartment I looked at has a small kitchen," Margaret said. "I could still cook sometimes. And there's a garden where residents can have their own plots. You could grow tomatoes again." "I could grow tomatoes again." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both imagining a future that looked nothing like the life they'd built in this house, but might possibly be something good anyway. David arrived that evening with legal documents for the house sale and debt consolidation papers. He spread them across the dining room table, explaining each form and its implications. "The assisted living facility requires a substantial deposit," he said. "But the timeline works. House sale closes, debts get paid down, and you'll have enough left for Margaret's first year at Sunrise Gardens plus a small emergency fund." "What about Lisa's money?" Margaret asked. "The savings she spent trying to save this place?" David consulted his notes. "Some of the debt forgiveness will actually benefit Lisa, since she'd co-signed on a few emergency loans. She won't recover everything she spent, but she won't be financially devastated either." Lisa shook her head. "I don't care about the money I spent. I care about making sure Mom is safe and happy." "Which is exactly why this plan might work," David replied. "You're both prioritizing the right things." As they signed document after document, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Relief. Not happiness exactly, but the peace that came with accepting reality instead of fighting it. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as David prepared to leave. "I want to give some things away before we move. James's tools to the neighbor who's always borrowed them. My teaching books to the school library. Things that should be used rather than stored." Lisa nodded. "I think Dad would like that." "I think he'd like all of this. He always said home wasn't a place, it was the people you shared it with." Margaret looked around the dining room one more time, at the table where they'd eaten thousands of meals, at the china cabinet full of dishes that would soon belong to someone else, at the window that looked out on the yard where Lisa had played as a child. The house that love had built was being sold, but the love itself was being preserved, redirected, given a new form that might actually serve them better than these walls ever had. "I'm ready," Margaret said, surprising herself by meaning it. "I'm ready to let go." Margaret stood in her new kitchen, smaller than the one she'd left behind, but perfectly sufficient for her needs. The apartment at Sunrise Gardens was bright and modern, with a balcony overlooking gardens where early spring bulbs were beginning to emerge. She'd been here 3 weeks now, and it was starting to feel like home, rather than just a place where she slept. "Mom, where do you want this?" Lisa asked, holding up a framed photo of Margaret and James on their honeymoon. They were both so young in the picture, standing in front of Niagara Falls with the kind of confidence that came from believing you could plan your entire life and have it turn out exactly as expected. The bedroom, I think, on the dresser next, to Dad's watch. They'd been unpacking slowly, taking time to decide which memories deserved space in Margaret's new life. Some items had been easy to leave behind, the formal dining set they'd rarely used, the heavy furniture that overwhelmed. Smaller rooms. Others had required difficult conversations about what truly mattered. The china had been the hardest decision. 8 place settings of spode Christmas tree pattern, purchased piece by piece during their early marriage when money was tight, but dreams were abundant. "It's meant for entertaining," Margaret had said, wrapping each piece carefully for storage. "I'm not going to be hosting dinner parties anymore." "But Mom, you love that china." "I love the memory of buying it with your father. I love the Christmas mornings when we used it for breakfast. I don't need the actual plates to keep those memories." Now the china sat in Lisa's condo, waiting for the dinner parties Lisa might someday host. The thought gave Margaret more pleasure than keeping the dishes would have. "Mrs. Chen?" A soft knock at the door interrupted Margaret's thoughts. "It's Claire from next door. I was wondering if you'd like to join us for afternoon tea." Margaret had met Claire Patterson during her first week, a retired librarian with sharp eyes and a mischievous sense of humor. Claire had lost her husband 2 years ago and had similar concerns about memory changes, though hers were less pronounced than Margaret's. "Go," Lisa encouraged, reading Margaret's hesitation correctly. "I can finish unpacking these books." Margaret grabbed her sweater and followed Claire down the hall to the community room, where a small group of residents had gathered around a table set with mismatched teacups and homemade cookies. The conversation flowed easily. Book recommendations, complaints about the dining room's tendency to oversalt everything, gentle gossip about which residents were developing romantic interests. "How are you settling in?" asked Robert Kim, a retired engineer whose wife lived in the memory care unit down the hall. "It takes time to feel at home." "I'm surprised by how much I like it," Margaret admitted. "I thought I'd feel trapped or diminished, but mostly I feel relieved." "Relief is underrated," observed Dorothy Chen, no relation, but the shared surname had sparked an immediate friendship. "I spent 10 years fighting my daughter about everything. Driving, cooking, managing finances. Fighting was exhausting." Margaret nodded, thinking about her own battles with Lisa. "We fought about my independence, but I think we were both fighting the wrong enemy." "What do you mean?" Claire asked. "We were fighting each other instead of fighting the real problem, my need for help and Lisa's need to know I was safe. Once we stopped fighting each other, we could actually solve the problem." When Margaret returned to her apartment an hour later, Lisa had finished organizing the books and was sitting on the small couch, looking through one of Margaret's photo albums. "Find anything interesting?" Margaret asked. "Pictures of you teaching. I'd forgotten how young you looked when you started at Roosevelt Elementary." Margaret sat beside her daughter, studying the photographs of her classroom from 30 years ago. Bulletin boards covered with student artwork, reading corners with beanbag chairs, her own face bright with enthusiasm and the certainty that she could make a difference in children's lives. "I was good at that job," Margaret said. "You were amazing at it. Do you know how many former students still ask about you when I run into them around town?" Margaret felt a warmth that had nothing to do with nostalgia. "What do they say?" "That you made them feel smart, that you never gave up on anyone, that your classroom felt safe." They sat quietly for a moment, turning pages that documented Margaret's career, Lisa's childhood, family vacations, and holiday celebrations. The photos told the story of a life well lived, even if some of those memories were becoming harder for Margaret to access. "I've been thinking about going back to school," Lisa said suddenly. "Maybe getting a master's degree in nonprofit management. There are some interesting programs that focus on senior services." Margaret looked at her daughter with surprise. "That's a significant career change." going through this with you, seeing how complicated the systems are, how hard it is to navigate everything. I think there's work I could do to help other families. Work that matters to you? Work that matters, period. I've been good at my current job, but I don't think I've been passionate about it. Maybe it's time to find something I care about as much as you cared about teaching. The conversation was interrupted by Margaret's phone ringing. Tommy Vega's name appeared on the screen. "Good news," Tommy said when Margaret answered. "The final creditor just agreed to our settlement offer. As of today, all your debts are officially resolved." Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd still been carrying. "All of them?" "All of them. You're starting fresh, Mrs. Chen. Clean slate." After hanging up, Margaret and Lisa sat in their small celebration. No champagne, just tea, and the satisfaction of having climbed out of a hole that had once seemed impossibly deep. "I should probably head home soon," Lisa said. "I have dinner plans." "Oh?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Anyone I know?" Lisa's cheeks flushed slightly. "Remember my friend Sarah from college? She's been divorced for about a year and we've been talking. It's just dinner, but it's been a long time since you've had dinner with someone who makes you blush. I wasn't sure I should mention it. With everything that's been happening, Lisa." Margaret took her daughter's hands. "Nothing that's been happening changes the fact that you deserve love and companionship. In fact, everything that's been happening proves that you're capable of enormous love and loyalty. Sarah would be lucky to have you." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "I feel guilty being happy when your life has been turned upside down." "My life needed to be turned upside down. I was holding on to things that were holding me back. Now I have afternoon tea with intelligent women, a daughter who's pursuing work she's passionate about, and no debt hanging over my head. Why shouldn't you be happy?" That evening, after Lisa left for her dinner date, Margaret walked through her small apartment, taking inventory of her new life. The bedroom with James's photo and his watch, reminders of love that had shaped her, but didn't define her current identity. The living room with carefully chosen books, and the comfortable chair where she read every evening. The kitchen where she prepared simple meals that nourished without overwhelming. She stepped onto the balcony and looked out at the gardens, where other residents were taking evening walks and talking quietly on benches. Tomorrow she would join the book club that Claire had recommended. Next week she would start the watercolor class that had caught her interest. In a month, she would attend Lisa's graduation from the caregiver support group they'd both been participating in. The phone rang again. Lisa, calling from the restaurant. "Just wanted to check in," Lisa said, though Margaret could hear laughter and conversation in the background. "Make sure you took your evening medication." "I took it. Now go enjoy your dinner and stop worrying about me." "I love you, Mom." "I love you too. Have fun." Margaret hung up and smiled. 6 months ago, that call would have felt intrusive, controlling. Tonight it felt like love, the right amount of care, offered with respect for her autonomy. She settled into her reading chair with the mystery novel Claire had lent her, a cup of herbal tea steaming beside her. Through the sliding door, she could hear the gentle sounds of her new community. People living their lives with dignity despite losses and limitations, supporting each other without losing themselves. The house that love had built was gone, sold to a young family who would fill it with their own dreams and disappointments. But love itself had proved more durable than any foundation they'd ever laid. It had survived the demolition of their old life and was already building something new, smaller perhaps, but more honest and sustainable than what they'd had before. Margaret opened her book and began to read, content in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring its own small adventures, and that love, properly tended, could grow in any soil. Margaret waited in the lobby of Sunrise Gardens, watching through the large windows as Lisa's familiar blue Honda pulled into the parking lot. Their weekly dinner tradition had become the highlight of Margaret's week, not because she was lonely, but because these evenings had evolved into something richer than obligation or duty. They'd become genuine friendship between two women who happened to be mother and daughter. "Ready for another thrilling evening at Romano's?" Lisa asked, giving Margaret a warm hug as she entered the lobby. "Actually, I was thinking we might try somewhere new tonight. Dorothy mentioned a Thai place that just opened downtown." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "My mother, the adventurous diner. What's next, skydiving?" "Don't tempt me. Robert's been talking about a hot air balloon festival next month." They settled into Lisa's car, and Margaret noticed a small velvet box on the passenger seat before Lisa quickly moved it to the console. "Should I pretend I didn't see that?" Margaret asked. Lisa's cheeks flushed. "Sarah and I have been talking about moving in together. It's not an engagement ring, just a promise ring, I guess. Something to mark that we're serious about building a life together." Margaret felt a flutter of joy that had nothing to do with her own life and everything to do with her daughter's happiness. "That's wonderful, Lisa. When do I get to meet her properly?" "Soon. She's nervous about the family approval thing. Tell her the bar is pretty low. Anyone who makes you light up the way you have for the past few months has already passed the important test." At the Thai restaurant, they ordered pad thai and green curry, dishes Margaret had never tried before coming to Sunrise Gardens. Her dining companions there had expanded her culinary horizons considerably. Claire's Korean heritage, Robert's love of Indian food, Dorothy's expertise in Jewish cuisine from her late husband's family. "I have news," Margaret said as they waited for their food. "I'm thinking about going back to work." Lisa nearly choked on her water. "Work? Mom, you're supposed to be retired." "Retired from my career, not from being useful. The community center here has an after-school program for local kids whose parents work late. They need someone to help with homework and reading. It's only 2 afternoons a week, but it's teaching again. It's helping again. I miss feeling useful, Lisa. I miss having something to contribute beyond my own maintenance and entertainment." Lisa studied her mother's face, and Margaret could see her daughter fighting old instincts to protect her from potential disappointment or exhaustion. "What does Dr. Williams think?" "She thinks it's a wonderful idea as long as I'm realistic about my limitations. If I have a bad day, I can call in. If my memory issues become problematic, we can reassess." "But Lisa, I need to try." "Then I think you should try." The simple acceptance, offered without conditions or warnings, felt like a gift. 6 months ago, Lisa would have created a list of potential problems and safety concerns. Now she trusted Margaret to know her own capabilities and to ask for help when she needed it. "How's the graduate program application going?" Margaret asked. "I submitted it last week. If I get accepted, I'll start in the fall. Sarah's been incredible about the whole thing. She actually helped me write my personal statement." "What did you write about?" Lisa smiled. "About learning that love and control aren't the same thing. About discovering that sometimes the best way to help someone is to trust them to help themselves." Their food arrived, and they ate while discussing Lisa's career plans, Margaret's book club's current selection, and Sarah's upcoming promotion at the nonprofit where she worked. Normal conversation between two adults who cared about each other's lives without feeling responsible for managing them. After dinner, instead of heading directly back to Sunrise Gardens, Lisa took a detour through their old neighborhood. "I haven't been back here since the closing," Margaret admitted as they turned onto Maple Street. "I drive by sometimes. I wanted to hate the new family, but they're actually lovely. Young couple with twin toddlers. The yard looks better than when we lived there." They parked across the street from Margaret's former house and sat quietly, taking in the changes. A swing set in the backyard, children's bicycles on the front porch, garden beds that had been replanted with bright annuals instead of Margaret's practical perennials. "It looks happy," Margaret said. "It does." Mrs. Kowalski emerged from her front door, as if she'd been watching for them. She crossed the street with the same determined gait Margaret remembered, though she seemed to have aged in the months since Margaret had moved away. "I was wondering when you two would come back for a visit," Mrs. Kowalski said, leaning down to the car window. "How are you settling in, Margaret?" "Better than I expected. I've made friends, I'm keeping busy. I actually feel younger." "If that makes sense." "Perfect sense. Sometimes we outgrow our old lives. Come on, let me introduce you to the Hendersons. They've been asking about the previous owners." The Henderson family was indeed lovely. Jake and Maria, both teachers, with 3-year-old twins named Emma and Sam. The children were playing in the backyard, their laughter echoing off the house that had once held Margaret's more serious memories. "Mrs. Chen!" Maria exclaimed when Mrs. Kowalski introduced them. "We've been hoping to meet you. The neighbors all speak so highly of you." "We found some things in the garage that might be yours," Jake added. "Previous owners' belongings that were left behind." He disappeared and returned with a small cardboard box. Inside, Margaret found treasures she hadn't even realized were missing. A trowel James had given her for their 5th anniversary, engraved with, "For the gardener who grows more than flowers," a small ceramic bird Lisa had made in 2nd grade art class. A few packets of seeds Margaret had saved from her mother's garden decades ago. "I can't believe you saved these," Margaret said, her eyes filling with tears. "They seem too personal." "To throw away," Maria replied. "We were hoping you'd come back for them." As they prepared to leave, Margaret turned to take one last look at the house. The children were still playing in the yard, their parents watching from the deck where Margaret had once sat with her coffee every morning. It was the same structure, but it was no longer her home. It belonged to this young family now, and it suited them. "No regrets?" Lisa asked as they drove away. "None," Margaret said, surprised to realize she meant it completely. "That house served its purpose for us. Now it's serving its purpose for them. I think that's how it's supposed to work." On the drive back to Sunrise Gardens, they talked about their plans for the following week. Lisa would meet Margaret for lunch on Wednesday, and Margaret would attend Lisa's graduation from the caregiver support group on Friday. Small commitments that wove their lives together without constraining either of them. "I've been thinking about what Dad used to say," Margaret said as they pulled into Sunrise Gardens. "About home being the people you share it with, not the place itself." "I remember." "I think he was right. But I think it's more than that. Home is the relationships you build with honesty and trust. Home is feeling safe to be yourself, even when yourself is changing." Lisa turned off the engine and sat quietly. For a moment. "Do you feel at home now? In your apartment? In your community?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I feel at home in my relationship with you. Everything else is just geography." They hugged goodbye in the lobby, as they did every week, but tonight the embrace felt different. Less like goodbye, and more like a promise. Margaret watched through the windows as Lisa drove away, then turned toward the elevator that would take her back to her small apartment and her new life. In her living room, she arranged the recovered treasures on her bookshelf, the trowel, the ceramic bird, the seed packets that might still grow into something beautiful. Tomorrow she would show them to Claire and Dorothy, sharing the story of their recovery. Next week, she would start volunteering with the after-school program, offering what she had to give without apologizing for what she couldn't. The house that love had built was gone, sold to pay for mistakes she couldn't remember making. But love itself had proved more durable than mortgages and more valuable than real estate. It had rebuilt itself in weekly dinners and daily phone calls, in shared decisions and respected autonomy, in the trust between two women who had learned that caring for each other meant allowing each other to grow. Margaret settled into her reading chair with Claire's latest book recommendation, a mystery set in a retirement community where the elderly residents solved crimes with wit and wisdom. Outside her balcony door, The gardens of Sunrise Gardens were settling into evening quiet, and she could hear the soft sounds of her neighbors, people who, like her, had discovered that endings could also be beginnings. The house that love rebuilt wasn't made of wood and brick. It was made of honesty and respect, of boundaries and connection, of the courage to let go of what was in order to embrace what could be. It was smaller than what they'd lost, but stronger, more flexible, designed to withstand whatever changes the future might bring. Margaret opened her book and began to read, content in the knowledge that home, finally, was not a place she might lose, but a relationship she helped create every day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.